Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're even remotely thinking about tech lately, there's this one thing that you absolutely have to have on your radar.
You got it.
Tariffs.
Yep.
We're talking about those taxes on imported goods and what they're going to mean for, well, basically every piece of tech you can think of.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. From tiny little components to the latest and greatest devices, you're listening to the Deep Dive, and we're breaking it all down for you.
So before we even get into the nitty-gritty, let's make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about tariffs, what exactly are we talking about?
In the simplest terms, think of it like this. A tariff is basically a tax that gets slapped onto a product when it's brought into the U.S. from another country.
Okay, makes sense. But why? What's the point of adding these tariffs?
Well, the idea is usually to try and balance out trade between countries and give a little boost to domestic manufacturing, encourage companies to make things here in the U.S.
Right, so it's not as simple as, oh, prices are going up. There's a whole strategy behind it.
Absolutely. There are lots of different factors at play. And it's important to remember that while those taxes are initially paid by the companies importing the goods, those costs, they tend to trickle down,
Yeah.
meaning eventually they hit us, the consumers. You and me.
Okay, so that new phone, that shiny new laptop, that could all get a little pricier thanks to these tariffs.
Exactly. And here's the thing. We're not talking about small incremental changes here. There's a lot on the table right now.
Oh yeah, this isn't just like a little tweak to the system, is it?
No, not at all. There's this idea of a universal tariff floating around, which, as the name suggests, would be a tariff applied to almost every single thing imported.
Wow, universal. That's a big deal.
It is. And on top of that, you've got these things called reciprocal tariffs, which are more targeted. They're aimed at specific countries that, let's say, have a significant trade surplus with the U.S.
So we're basically talking about tariffs on top of tariffs.
Potentially, yes. The universal tariff plus these reciprocal tariffs, they all add up.
Okay, so now I'm starting to get a little nervous here. This sounds like it could really impact what we're paying for tech, and not just a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very reasonable concern. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive, right? We want to figure out, as best as we can, what this all means for you, for the everyday consumer, for businesses. What's the impact going to be on the price you'll see at checkout? Will the tech you want even be readily available? These are the questions we're tackling.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk numbers. What are we looking at price-wise if these tariffs go into effect?
Okay, well, the first thing to understand is that, broadly speaking, pretty much every analysis out there is predicting a general increase in the cost of electronics. Hardware across the board is expected to get more expensive.
Okay, and we're talking
noticeable increases, not just a couple of bucks here and there.
Yeah, I mean, give me a sense of the scale here.
All right, so one analysis laid out a couple of different scenarios. They were focusing specifically on tariffs on goods coming in from China. Now, under one scenario, they imagined a 10% universal tariff combined with a 60% tariff on Chinese imports.
Okay, so a double whammy on anything coming from China.
Exactly. And in that scenario, they predicted that laptops and tablets, those could see price increases anywhere from 46% to, get this, 68%.
Well, that's 68%. That's almost a 70% jump. I mean, people are used to budgeting for a certain amount for a laptop, and then suddenly it's like, bam, way more expensive.
It's a big change for sure. And keep in mind, that's just one scenario.
Okay, so what about the other scenario? How does that one look?
Well, in their second scenario, they bumped those numbers up even more. A 20% universal tariff and then a 100% tariff on Chinese imports.
Okay, so basically double the tariffs across the board.
Right. And under those conditions, the projections get even more intense. We're talking video game consoles, for example, potentially seeing price hikes from 62% to over 100%.
Wow, over 100%. That means if you were thinking about spending, say, $500 on a console before, you might be looking at over $1,000 now.
It's a massive difference. And it's not just consoles. Smartphones, they're not safe either. Those could see price increases anywhere from 26% to 37% in the first scenario. And then, under the higher tariffs, we're talking 57% to almost 100%.
Geez, so basically everything is going up.
And don't forget all those other gadgets that are becoming so common these days. Your smart home devices like smartwatches, smart speakers, all that stuff. They're looking at price increases around 10% to 18%, depending on how these tariffs shake out.
It's kind of overwhelming when you think about it. Everything is connected, and everything is potentially going up in price.
That's the reality of it, unfortunately. And it's not just the big ticket items either.
What do you mean?
Well, think about all the accessories. Things like keyboards, mice, webcams, those are all going to be affected too. Those could see price jumps around 12% to 19%. And headphones, another popular item, well, a huge chunk of those are imported from China. So they could see price increases of over 16% under that higher tariff scenario.
So basically, anything with a plug is going to cost more.
It's looking that way. Even monitors and TVs, those could be hit hard too. The average tariff on those could exceed 50% for monitors and 30% for TVs.
Wow, so it really does seem like no tech is safe from these price increases.
It's tough to say for sure exactly what the final numbers will be, but the trend is pretty clear.
It's definitely a lot to digest, and it's important for our listeners to understand this is all based on projections, right?
Yeah.
We're working with the information we have, but the reality might play out a little differently.
Right, exactly. These are estimates, and a lot depends on how businesses react. I mean, those numbers we were talking about, they're assuming that companies pass on 100% of those added costs from the tariffs directly to the consumers.
Oh, so there's a chance some companies might try to absorb some of those costs themselves.
It's possible. Some companies might try to eat some of the cost, maybe as a way to stay competitive, but in the long run, it's really unlikely they can absorb all of it.
So it really does seem like we should brace ourselves for tech getting more expensive across the board.
That's the most likely scenario. And to really understand why this is happening, we need to dig a little deeper into how tech products are made.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay, so the key thing to grasp is that the supply chain for electronics is incredibly globalized.
Meaning?
Meaning the parts for your phone, for your computer, they're not all just magically appearing from factories in the US. It's a worldwide network of suppliers.
Right. But I thought a lot of tech was assembled here in the U.S.
Some of it is, yes, but even then, a lot of the crucial components, the brains of the operation, so to speak, they're often manufactured in countries that are very likely to be impacted by these new tariffs.
So we're talking China mainly, right?
China is a big one, yes. But it's not just them. Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, these are all major players in the tech supply chain, and they're all potentially looking at higher tariffs.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. This is having real-world impacts already.
You're absolutely right. I was reading about this one PC builder. They actually build computers here in the US. They're already saying they're expecting a price increase of 20% to 25% on their systems. And it's all because of these tariffs on the components they need.
Wow, that's a really stark example of how interconnected this whole thing is. It really drives home the point that even if a product is assembled in the U.S., it doesn't mean it's immune to these tariffs.
Exactly. The reality is, it's just not as simple as flipping a switch and saying, okay, let's make everything in America now.
I guess it makes sense. You can't just build a whole new tech manufacturing sector overnight.
That's right. For a lot of these specialized materials and the incredibly complex processes involved in making these advanced tech components, the U.S. just doesn't have that level of established expertise or infrastructure at scale right now.
So it's not just a question of wanting to make things domestically, it's also a question of capability.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned semiconductors earlier, and I remember hearing a lot of buzz about those potentially being hit hard by these tariffs. Where do things stand with those now?
Yeah, semiconductors are a really interesting case. They're essentially the tiny chips that power pretty much all our electronics. And initially, there was a lot of talk about them being subject to these reciprocal tariffs.
Which would have been a huge deal, right? I mean, they're in everything.
Absolutely. But it looks like they may have gotten a bit of a reprieve. It seems like they might be exempt from those specific reciprocal tariffs.
So a bit of good news there.
Yeah.
But hold on, you said exempt from those specific tariffs. What does that mean exactly?
Well, remember we talked about two types of tariffs, those reciprocal ones, and then that universal tariff. So even if semiconductors dodged the bullet on those targeted reciprocal tariffs, they'd still likely be subject to that universal tariff that we talked about earlier.
Ah, okay, so not completely in the clear then.
Right, and even just the talk, just the uncertainty around all of this trade policy stuff, it's already caused a lot of volatility in the stock prices of companies involved in semiconductors.
That makes sense. It's such a crucial part of the tech world. Any changes are going to send ripples through the entire industry.
Exactly. And speaking of specific parts of the tech world, there are a few areas I know people are particularly concerned about. Gaming consoles, for example, those are already being impacted.
Really? In what way?
Well, there have been reports of pre-orders for an upcoming Nintendo console actually being delayed because of these tariffs.
Wow, so that's a real tangible impact we're seeing right now.
It is, and for those high-end consoles that are already out, well, a lot of experts are saying, listen, if you're thinking about buying one, do it now, don't wait.
Why is that?
Because they expect any new shipments of those consoles that come in after these tariffs take effect, well, those are going to have higher prices to reflect those added costs.
Ah, so it's like a buy now before it's too late kind of situation.
Exactly. And it's not just consoles either. Laptops are another big one. One of the major PC manufacturers, they just recently announced a 10% price increase across the board, and they explicitly said it's because of these tariffs.
Wow, so they're not even waiting to see what happens. They're already adjusting their prices.
And if you're into smart home tech, well, that's not going to escape unscathed either. The prediction is that anything over $200, those higher-end smart home devices, those are going to see the most noticeable price hikes.
Makes sense. I guess the more expensive the device, the more those added costs from tariffs are going to be felt.
Right, but honestly, given how global the sourcing is for pretty much all smart home devices, it's hard to imagine anything in that category staying totally unaffected. Even the cheaper stuff is likely to see some sort of price bump.
Okay, so we've covered gaming, laptops, smart home. What about cameras?
Cameras, too. It might not be the first thing people think about when it comes to these tech tariffs, but they are definitely in the mix.
So what's the advice there? Buy now before they get more expensive.
That seems to be the general consensus, yeah. If you've been thinking about a new camera, pulling the trigger sooner rather than later might be the way to go.
All right, so this is a lot for any individual to take in. But we also need to talk about the bigger picture here. I mean, this isn't just impacting people's personal tech budgets, right?
Oh, absolutely not. These tariffs are poised to have a massive impact on businesses too, especially those in the tech sector. I was reading this report from IDC, which is a major analysis firm, and they're actually warning that these U.S. tariffs could really slam the brakes on global IT spending.
Really? How so?
Well, they're saying that between these higher prices for tech and all the disruptions these tariffs are causing in those complex global supply chains, it could actually cut the growth forecasts for IT spending in half. And they're not just talking about the U.S., they're talking about the whole world.
Wow, that's huge.
Hmm.
And I guess if businesses aren't spending as much on tech, that could have ripple effects throughout the whole economy.
Exactly. And that's what some folks are really worried about, this idea that all of this could contribute to a wider economic slowdown. Nobody wants to see that happen.
So for those businesses out there who are listening, I mean, what are they supposed to do? How do they navigate this?
Well, the first thing is don't panic, but definitely don't bury your head in the sand either.
Solid advice.
Tech leaders need to be proactive.
Yeah.
They need to take a hard look at their budgets, really assess the potential risks and opportunities, and talk to their suppliers. Collaboration is key here. And most importantly, they need to build flexibility into their strategies. The more agile they can be, the better they'll be able to weather this storm.
So any specific steps they can take right now?
Absolutely. In the short term, a good first step is to take stock of what they've already got. What equipment do they have? What orders are already in the pipeline? It might even make sense for some companies to consider, stocking up on certain essentials if they can.
Almost like a prepper mentality, but for businesses.
Kind of, yeah. And they also need to be paying close attention to what their competitors are doing. All this upheaval could create some unexpected opportunities, but also some real challenges if you're not paying attention.
Makes sense. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, as they say.
Exactly. And another practical thing companies can do is look into any programs or opportunities that might be out there to help mitigate the impact of these tariffs. Like, are there any customs programs they could leverage to reduce their burden? It's worth exploring those options.
Okay, so that's short term. What about long-term strategies? What should companies be thinking about there?
So long term, one of the biggest things is going to be diversifying their supply chains, not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. If they're heavily reliant on any one particular region for their components or assembly, well, that's a vulnerability.
I guess if there's one thing this whole tariff situation is highlighting, it's the importance of having options.
Exactly. And another thing companies might want to consider is what's called geographic diversification. Basically, that means spreading out their talent and infrastructure across different regions. It's a way to hedge their bets, so if one area gets hit hard by trade disruptions, well, they've got other bases covered.
So kind of like a don't put all your eggs in one basket approach, but applied to geography.
Precisely. And another key thing is building in more cost flexibility wherever they can. Like maybe they can rely more on licensing models, cloud-based services, subscription-based options, things like that. Those can provide a bit of a cushion against the volatility we're seeing in prices right now.
So less upfront cost, more of a spread out, predictable payment structure.
Exactly. And I even saw some folks talking about this idea of hardware as a service, or HaaS, as a potential
Tell
solution.
me more about that.
So basically, it's a way for businesses to essentially rent their hardware instead of buying it outright.
Hmm. Interesting. So what's the benefit there?
Well, it could allow them to lock in the current hardware costs and have more predictable expenses month to month. It could act as a kind of shield against those price fluctuations that we're expecting from these tariffs.
Okay, so it's a way to create a bit of stability in an otherwise unstable market.
Exactly. And all of this is happening in the context of global trade, which is a complex web of relationships and agreements. And it's important to remember the U.S. imposing these tariffs, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Right. Other countries could retaliate.
Right, it's very possible. Other countries might very well respond by imposing their own tariffs on goods coming from the U.S. It's like a tit for tat. And that could create even more uncertainty in the global trade environment. And it might even impact things like tech services that cross borders.
Yeah, it's like a chain reaction. One action leads to another, and pretty soon everything is more complicated than it was before.
Exactly. And some analysts are even saying that if these tariffs stick around for a while, we could be looking at some really significant long-term disruptions to the global economy.
So it's not just about the price of a new laptop. It's potentially much bigger than that.
Right. The stakes are high. But there is a possibility that some of the existing international trade agreements might be renegotiated as countries try to adapt to this new reality.
So maybe some good could come out of all of this, potentially.
Maybe. And, there are a lot of different opinions out there about how this will all play out on a global scale. Some folks are saying that if the U.S., as the world's largest consumer market, sees those price increases from these tariffs, well, that could push prices up worldwide.
Makes sense. If things cost more in the U.S., it could have a ripple effect.
Right. But then there are other experts who believe that companies might actually shift their focus away from the U.S. market if these tariffs make it less profitable to do business here.
So in that case, the U.S. might see higher prices, but other regions could actually see lower prices.
It's a possibility. It really depends on how different players react.
Okay, so a lot of potential scenarios, a lot of unknowns. But for our listeners, I think the most pressing question is, how is all of this going to affect their wallets, their personal finances?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And unfortunately, the outlook isn't super rosy. A lot of forecasts are predicting that the overall purchasing power of the average U.S. consumer could drop significantly, like in the range of $90 billion to $143 billion, just because everyday tech products are likely to get pricier.
Wow, that's a big number. And that's spread across the entire population. So it's not like just a few people are going to be affected. This is going to touch everyone.
Exactly. And as those prices go up, it makes sense that people are going to buy less. I was reading about these projections that suggest we could see some pretty big drops in how much of certain tech products people buy. Like in some of those higher tariff scenarios, the sale of laptops and tablets could fall by 54% to 66%, smartphones by 44% to 54%, and video game consoles by a whopping 57% to 68%.
So not only are things getting more expensive, but fewer people are going to be able to afford them anyway. It's kind of a double whammy for the tech industry.
Definitely. And some people are even going so far as to call these tariffs a national sales tax. Their argument is that it's going to lead to higher inflation and potentially even worsen poverty as the cost of, well, everything, including tech in a lot of cases, goes up.
So not just a tech issue, but a broader economic issue as well.
Absolutely. And one interesting potential side effect of all of this is that the market for pre-owned and refurbished tech could get a boost.
Yeah, if new stuff is too expensive, people are going to be looking for alternatives. Makes sense.
Right, exactly. Used and refurbished devices could become a much more attractive option for people trying to save some money. But even there, it might not be smooth sailing. If the cost of new devices stays high for a prolonged period, well, that increased demand for used devices could actually drive those prices up too.
So there might not be a real escape from higher prices, no matter which way you turn.
It's a tough situation for sure.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for people to remember is that these new tariffs on imported goods are almost certainly going to lead to higher prices across the tech industry. It's also very likely we'll see companies having to make adjustments to their global supply chains to adapt.
So buckle up, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, the exact impact of all of this is going to vary depending on the specific product and how these global trade relationships evolve, which, let's face it, is pretty unpredictable right now.
So if you're thinking about buying a new gadget, especially something pricey like a gaming console, a laptop, a smart home hub, the advice seems to be don't wait. Get it now before those prices potentially jump even higher.
Good advice. And for businesses out there, the key takeaway is to be proactive. Start planning now. Look at how you can diversify your supply chains. Consider exploring things like hardware as a service, those kinds of flexible consumption models. Those are the kinds of moves that are going to help you navigate the situation and come out on the other side in a good position.
Well said. And one thing that's really been driven home for me throughout this whole discussion is just how interconnected the global tech supply chain really is. One change in one place can have these ripple effects that are felt worldwide.
It's an intricate web, that's for sure.
And as these tariffs continue to unfold, the best thing we can all do is stay informed, stay flexible, and be prepared to adapt as things change. Because, let's be honest, things are probably going to keep changing for a while.
No doubt about it. This is a story that's still being written.
It is. And we'll be here to help you make sense of it all every step of the way. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay ahead of the curve.
See you next time.
All right, take care.